Welcome, deer hunters, managers, and enthusiasts. This is Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. My name is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. Bronson and I are professors of wildlife management and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. Together, we've researched deer across the United States for more than 40 years. In our podcasts, we explain the why and how of deer management based on science. Whether it's research we've conducted or explaining research done elsewhere, we'll offer you a college course in the science of deer management.
But don't let Steve scare you. This isn't going to be a review of calculus or chemistry. Instead, we take results of research, reduce it to what's important, and explain how you can apply research to management. So join us for this episode of Deer University. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm again have the wonderful pleasure of filming this podcast up in Maine. I'm with two extension colleagues here today, and we are organizing a youth conservation event called the Wildlife Habitat Education Program. And so we're going to be out in the field for the next 2 days working with sophomores, juniors, and seniors, primarily in high school, and teaching them about habitat management for wildlife. So while I have these two guys here who are both from the Midwest, I wanted to bend their ear a little bit and let's talk about some compare and contrast deer management in the Southeast with that in the Midwest. I know there's a lot of people in the Midwest that listen to the podcast and wanted to basically examine some of those differences, and I will probably learn something today as well. So I'm looking forward to this. First guest, and I'm going to let them give a little bit of history about themselves, but Jared Brooke is from Purdue University. I'm going to let you say a little bit more in a second. And Adam Janke is from Iowa State University. So Jared, let's start with you. Just a little information, where you're from, where you went to school, where you're at now, and kind of the things you do in your day-to-day job.
So I'm an Indiana native, originally from kind of east central Indiana. I did my undergrad degree at Purdue University in wildlife science. And then I left Purdue after graduation and headed south to the University of Tennessee to do a master's project. And my master's project was actually focused on northern bobwhite ecology on reclaimed coal mines in Kentucky. But along the way, I worked on a lot of projects related to habitat management, prescribed fire, herbicide, forest management type stuff for deer, turkey, and other game species. And I was working with the extension specialist down there, Craig Harper.
Craig who?
Craig Harper.
Craig Harper.
You don't know that guy, do you?
No, I thought I did, but I don't.
Okay, yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I worked down there for a while, and then I left University of Tennessee after graduating with a master's degree. Went and worked in Kentucky for a little while as a private lands biologist for the state in west central Kentucky, dealing with farm bill programs, so things, the whole alphabet soup of CRP and EQIP and WRP and that whole game. And then I had the opportunity to come back to my home base, my alma mater, and come back to Purdue as an extension wildlife specialist. And so my day-to-day operations are really working with different stakeholders around the state to provide the research that is occurring at Purdue and at Mississippi State and Iowa State and other universities, take that information and provide it to the end users. So whether that be a landowner who's managing for quail or deer, or a agency biologist, or someone that works for NRCS or some other natural resources professional. And I deal a lot with habitat management for various species, and game species specifically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. But I also they get to do fun things like this where we're in Maine, and so we get to work a lot with youth education and connecting to the youth outdoors. So.
And it's also, what's the temperature now? I want to remind my Mississippians.
I think it's in the 60s today.
In the 60s today. Yeah, and today is July 22nd.
And it's probably hot for people in Maine.
Yeah, they're warm. Okay, Adam, a.k.a. the recovering waterfowl biologist.
Oh, I don't know about recovering.
Yeah, let's go with recovery.
Okay.
Because we're trying to steer you in a different direction.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll try. So my name is Adam Janke. I'm share the same title as Jared, Extension Wildlife Specialist at Iowa State. And actually, just like Jared, we kind of followed a similar trajectory right behind one another through school. I grew up in northern Indiana, and then went to school at Purdue, studied wildlife, then went to Ohio State University, studied bobwhite quail over there for a master's degree, similar to the work Jared did in Kentucky. And then I actually went out to South Dakota, and that's where I found my waterfowl roots. Grew up a duck hunter, and always knew I wanted to study ducks and wetlands, and so I ended up in South Dakota to study ducks and wetlands for my PhD. And I did that, and then right after that, this position at Iowa State was advertised, Extension Wildlife Specialist, and interviewed and got the job and started there in 2016. And I think it's my dream job. Most days I still think that.
Me too.
We're just a wildlife biologist at the university and have really broad responsibilities for all things wildlife. So I wrote a PhD dissertation on ducks, started at Iowa State, and realized I didn't know very much about all sorts of things wildlife related. And so it's been really fun, 2.5 years in this position. I do things mostly focused on wildlife habitat management, or that's definitely where my interests are. I still am engaged with research. My students and I work primarily on ducks. That's why I resist the label of recovering waterfowl guy. But we work on wildlife habitat relationships on farms. And as I'm sure we're going to talk, bird conservation, particularly early successional bird conservation, is a little more challenging in Iowa than deer management, deer habitat. Listeners didn't get to see Bronson's face right there when I said that, but
the contortion took place. Yeah.
So we focus on where we can create early successional habitats or wetland habitats on working farms. That's where my research interests are. And of course, deer are the beneficiary of that, turkeys are the beneficiary of that, and a whole bunch of non-game animals, herps, reptiles, and the like. So yeah, and then also I do stuff on just general educational programming, like chronic wasting disease in Iowa, white nose syndrome in bats, and other sort of high-profile wildlife issues. So it's pretty fun. You never know what you're going to be doing from week to week. And
some pretty big deer are killed in Iowa, right?
I've heard
you
that.
Are aware
I am not
of
one that has, but yes, okay. I've noticed we can grow some deer in Iowa. That's for sure.
Hey, don't count out Indiana from that either.
Oh, that's true too.
Yeah, you'll harvest some really good deer too. So Adam, you gave me a stat last night that was staggering to me. I mean, I do think of Iowa as an ag ocean.
Sure.
What was the number, the percentage of agriculture?
Yeah. So the 82% of Iowa's land area is in production ag. So that doesn't include roads, buildings, forested areas, lakes, rivers, streams. 82% of the land area is production ag. So it's a pretty remarkable footprint in the state. And that includes primarily 2 crops, corn and beans, but that does also include working grass like pasture, which is relatively more common in southern Iowa. Actually, where the big deer are really harvested is in country where there's a mix of pasture and row crop production, and then of course a lot of forested acres as well. So,
okay, so similar breakdown in Indiana.
We're a little more forested in Indiana, and that's mostly contained in the southern part of the state. So we're actually around 54% ag, again mainly corn and soybean rotation, and then we have about 20% forest in the state, right around 20%. So we're a little more forested. We get a little more of the central hardwoods in the southern part of the state. So very little pine, lots of oak hickory.
We're, I guess we would be less, obviously, than both of y'all. So we're probably, don't quote me on this, even though it's on a podcast, we're probably 30% row crop ag.
Row crop, okay.
And that's mainly, we have this area you've heard us call, our Delta region, and that's just Mississippi alluvial valley, so it's very fertile soil. It's also very flat, and so that's our ag region. And then the remainder of it, there's scattered pasture and some other. We have a black belt region that has some ag, but it's mainly forested in some form. So, okay, so if we contrast things, you guys in the growing season from May until whenever that terminates for y'all, September, October, you have more food on the landscape than a deer population can possibly eat.
Yeah.
Even though there's a lot of producers up there that get angry at what soybean and corn are eaten, but essentially you have an unlimited supply of food. But so the limiting factor is going to be cover.
That's right. Cover is king.
Cover is king.
In Indiana. I'm sure it is in Iowa as well.
So, Jared, if a landowner were to contact you and say, what can I do to grow a deer population in my area? What is your typical response? I'm sure you want to learn about the area, get an aerial photo, talk
Exactly.
through.
So kind of get a breakdown of what different vegetation types they have on the property. So, how much of the property is row crop, how much of the property is forested, and how much of it is in some sort of other permanent vegetation, whether that be planted native grasses, old fields, pasture, and such like that. With most of the state being ag, typically some of the best things that landowners can do, and some of the things that I tell landowners to do, is if you have the opportunity to take some areas out of production to create some more cover, especially through just letting things go fallow, maybe enrolling in some of the farm bill programs if you're interested in trying to recoup some of the money you would lose from retiring land. So that right there can gain you a whole lot, because those areas, those early successional areas, are perfect bedding cover for deer. Mm-hmm. They're great for fawns. They provide all kinds of food and cover year round. Food in the summer mainly, but cover year round. So that'd be one. And then, taking a look at, if they have forested areas, take a look at what their forests are comprised of. And so, what kind of species are there, what age of the forest. Most of our forests are right around that kind of 80 to 100 year old. And so pretty open underneath. And we have a lot of oak hickory forests in the state. So kind of get a species composition, and then also look at, what kind of invasive species we have, because there's not many properties in the state that don't have some sort of issue. If we're in the northern part of the central and northern part of the state, bush honeysuckle is a really bad one that chokes out a lot of these small woodlots. Multiflora rose is a bad one throughout the state. And so kind of taking a look and seeing what issues are there and seeing how we can control those to do other management on the farm.
Okay. What are the primary timber species? You said oak hickory. Within the oaks, what are the most common oaks?
So most common oaks we have are going to be northern red, white, so just Quercus alba, and then we're going to have some areas that have chinkapin oaks. If you get into the northwestern part of the state, you're going to get more bur oaks and some of the transition areas from the forest of the east to the prairie of the west. We're going to have big bur oaks, black oaks. Down in the southern part of the state, you'll get into some scarlet oaks and some chestnut oaks. And those are our main oak species. But I would say white and northern red are probably the most common across the state.
Is oak amassed ever limiting? If you have so many species, and if oak is the primary component of your forest, and I'm contrasting that within the South, where you might have a pine forest, and just on the fringes you have some oak trees here and there.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we want to increase the oak element in our stands. Is that an issue?
I would say it is in the southern part of the state, because we're to the point where we're transitioning from an oak hickory forest to a beech maple, because we've excluded fire. We're not harvesting as much timber to create those openings that oaks need. So we're kind of, in some of the areas, we're transitioning from what was historically oak hickory now to more beech maple. And so I'd say that, especially in the southern part of the state where we're more forested, that oak acorns can be limiting when there's not a good crop.
Okay. So most often when you meet with people, what do they choose to do? Do they choose to, I'm going to manage my forest, or do they choose to enroll in a conservation program where they can take some crop out of production?
Most of the time, the first thing that landowners that I deal with want to talk about are food plots, right? And that's fine. I will talk about food plots all day. I like to plant food plots, and I see food plots, they certainly have benefits from a hunting standpoint and a supplemental food standpoint, but I see food plots as a catalyst for other management. And so if I can get a landowner that's interested in food plots, more than likely I can get them to do something else that is going to provide more than just food, provide cover as well. And typically that's starting in the fields. And so that's usually landowners, if they're wanting to do some other sort of habitat management, they start in the fields. So maybe it's planting native warm-season grass. We get that a lot. Maybe it's killing fescue in a pasture to release the seed bank to get some good native plants and forbs and grasses in there. Typically, the last place they go is the woods, in my experience.
Yeah,
Same with you, Adam?
I think so. I think we have a tendency to focus on open areas. We have a tendency to like to work in areas that we are accustomed to working in, and that's, of course, the fields. And we have the same problem in Iowa with invasive species. And I think the best thing most people could do in their timber is to manage certain species of invasive species. Some of them I don't lose sleep over, but Jared already mentioned bush honeysuckle. And it's a real problem, particularly on forest edges and disturbed areas in forest, and it can really take over. And I don't know, I'm not personally aware of a study that's looked at whether or not deer eat it. I'd be curious if you guys knew of any, but my impression is because it's so abundant and everything else in our forest systems, particularly regenerating oak and others, are subjected to too much deer browse pressure, that honeysuckle is avoided by deer. And so I get the impression that as invasive species, particularly honeysuckle, come into a forest more and more, where you're actually probably reducing your browse resources, increasing pressure on other more desirable species of browse and native regenerating trees that could eventually produce mast, and creating a system where the forest is going to become much less productive for deer. And so so that was a long-winded way of saying we don't spend enough time doing sound forest stewardship, I think, in the name of wildlife habitat management and specifically deer habitat management in the Midwest.
So would people in your neck of the woods, would they be willing to go out there with a chainsaw, go out there and hack and squirt and just go through a timber stand and kill some trees?
As far as overstory trees, or as far as
mid-story or overstory?
I think if you get the really engaged landowner that's really interested, I would certainly think that they would be willing to go out there and do that. And I think that's one way to do it, is just create some openings in your forest to get some of that browse back and get some of that food and cover back in the area. And I would always caution landowners before they start doing that to look at the invasive species they have, because most of the time if you do that, especially things like multiflora rose, they're just going to explode if they're not controlled prior to, or if you don't at least have a plan of how you're going to control it. And so think about what invasives are there before you do that. The other option is to get a forester in there and mark some timber and actually make some money off the timber.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're hoping to make money, that can certainly help pay for the management you want to do on the property. There's certainly nothing wrong with going in there and girdling some of your lesser value or lesser wildlife value trees. We have lots of sugar maple in the southern part of the state, and even lots of beech. So going in there and girdling some of the beech and girdling some of the maples to create room for other species is certainly a good option.
Okay.
It's just one of those cost benefit now you got to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with what Jared said about the potential for revenue generation, and also, invite a forester onto your land to talk about future revenue generation, because the actions we take in the forest today, of course, we could reap the benefits or
consequences
or
decades
exactly decades later. So think about who's next in line, and what's coming up in the understory could be really consequential. So in the same things, the things that grow straight, tall timber, particularly oak timber in Iowa, are the same things that produce larger mast crops and create more diverse cover for deer in the understory. Thinking about shade tolerance and increasing the crown density, or the area of the crown that's getting sunlight, will all increase the production of acorns and regeneration of oaks, and that's going to be really good for deer and wild turkeys and others.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Something that's become really popular, and for good reason, over the last decade, and it's certainly taken hold in Yankee land, where y'all are at, and it's not so much in the South yet, is cover crops.
Oh, okay.
And so for those that don't know, this is a really, really simple term or definition. A cover crop is essentially used to improve soil health, and mainly it's for use of erosion, to minimize erosion, to increase organic matter and things like that. And so the way a cover crop is always used, if it's done correctly, in conjunction with no-till, whether it be a drill or something like that. But anyway, you don't use cover crops with conventional tillage if you're going to reap the benefit of it. So believe it or not, a lot of these cover crops that we see are really good cool season deer forages. And so very, very often when you get a mix, probably you guys help me out on this, one of the most common ones I see is going to be an oat or a rye. There might be some different varieties, but a cereal grain, typically an oat or a rye. There's going to be a brassica, typically a radish, and there's going to be a legume that is usually crimson clover. And there's all sorts of mixes and combinations of that. But all three of those, if you went to any store and picked up a bag of a cool season mix, more than likely you're going to have a cereal grain like that, a brassica, and a clover. How are people accepting the use of cover crops, respectively, in your neck of the woods, not only for the benefit of the soil benefit, that hopefully over time is going to increase the yield? It maybe not increase the yield for the producer, but it will reduce input cost for the producer. Are people seeing the benefit of that for deer and for wildlife?
I think if you have a landowner that's a farmer and a hunter, then they see both the benefits of it from an aspect of, this could help with soil health and it could help with reducing my fertilizer costs, maybe reduce weed pressure. But certainly in the back of their minds, they got to be thinking, man, I can go pick up a bag of this seed here and plant it in a food plot. It's the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. So I would say that if they're both, they probably are seeing the benefits of it.
Is there any combination in Indiana that you see, a mixture that you see most common?
Straight cereal rye. So cereal rye only is probably our most common cover crop. And then if you get into mixes, it's cereal rye, crimson clover, and some sort of brassica. And we don't use oats a whole lot because oats will frost kill. So that's what we have to deal with a lot. Yeah. And so they'll make it till November, December, and then they'll be killed by the frost. So cereal rye is a good one because we can plant it really late, plant it in November and even early December and still get a good crop in the spring from the cereal rye. So that's a big one for us.
And Jared, when are they terminated usually?
Probably
depends on what crop is going to follow up, but
it's probably late March, early April to May is probably the time frame that they're
okay.
terminated. Probably if they're going into corn, it's terminated first, and then if they're going into beans, it's terminated later.
So theoretically, you could still have a gap. Let's say you're going to follow up a soybean. Theoretically, you could have about a month gap with very little food in terms of agriculture on the landscape if you use cover crops. But some people, and my knowledge of cover crops is, in my pinky finger here, but, we just haven't used it a long time in the South, but a lot of people are drilling into the cover crop. Mm-hmm. And so you might be using some type of implement to push the rye over, and break it down and then drill right in it. Is more commonly you're going to be killing it with glyphosate? Burning it down with glyphosate?
Most of the cover crops are going to be burned down with some sort of herbicide, typically glyphosate. Maybe some of the smaller farmers, or I think Adam and I were talking about this, some of the organic farmers are going to use a roller crimper to roll the cover crops down, but most of the cover crops are going to be terminated with some sort of herbicide. And they may plant into them green, or they may burn it down before they plant into it.
Okay.
But
similar things going on in Iowa. Iowa has a little bit shorter growing season on the western edge of the Corn Belt than Indiana does, so we haven't seen adoption at the scale that Indiana has with cover crops. But what Jared said about mixes and things is very similar to the agronomic recommendations we're hearing. Folks that are making these decisions based on agronomy, crop production, or based on water quality, which is the real, water quality and soil health are the two real benefits of cover crops. They tend to be planting cereal rye. They're flying it on or drilling it in, or planting it with these, I think they call them high boys.
Hydro seeders behind the high boy sprayers.
Yeah. So they've got some pretty creative techniques. They're putting it on. And I think it's a good thing. You take a field that would have otherwise been black dirt for 6 months of the year, and you're growing something on it. It's good for a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And I do think there's potential for deer to use that forage. It's interesting for me. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, can I ask Bronson questions here on the podcast? Because I don't know that much about the details of deer management. I think the points you made about the mixes being appealing or matching recommendations we make for cover or for food plots is an interesting perspective. So it would be neat to see producers experiment with that. People that are maybe don't farm themselves but own land, which is of course a huge fraction, over half of the land I think in Iowa. Don't quote me on that number. A large percentage of the land in Iowa is owned by people that haven't touched the tractor. And maybe those people, if they deer hunt or whatever, could encourage their tenants to use cover crops. You're going to get the soil health benefits, and then maybe it'll improve the deer forage a little bit. That's a win-win.
Well, yeah. If there's nothing there, it has to.
Right.
So
yeah, I agree.
You're talking about you have all the corn and soybeans 6 months, 5 months out of the year, and then now you have a barren field, and you have very little woods relative to the fields that you have. So I think cover crops can be fantastic. The biggest mistake I've seen people use is they think that this crop is going to improve soil health and then continue to use conventional tillage. So that's the first thing I learned is, and I've seen that in hunting magazines too, what do you need to know about cover crops for deer food plots? And they're using conventional tillage, and so all that is lost when you turn the soil over. One thing I'm interested in it, our soils, and it varies a lot, but generally speaking, high clay content, acidic, and a lot of times wet. And so we deal with hard pans a lot too, and so water just sitting there and sitting there. So I became really interested in, could someone slowly evolve into a system to where with the rye and the radish start getting some greater porosity to drain the water. And maybe some other benefits would happen too. So to me, it was like if you're already using these plants anyway, maybe we can convince you to use a drill from here on out and start improving your soil and have less input costs.
So as far as cover crop goes, Indiana, so we have, I think, around 10 or 11 million acres in crop. And we have a million acres, at least a million acres from surveys they've done that are in cover crops. So 10% of our agricultural land base is in cover crops.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable land use change, and that's going to have wildlife impacts. And in Iowa, I know those numbers too. We have 23 million acres of corn and beans in Iowa, and we have about, I think, it's between 600,000 and 800,000 acres of cover crops. And that's because, as I mentioned, our growing seasons are different, or that's at least my understanding. So adoption's lagged a little bit, and they're trying to figure out, they being the agronomists, trying to figure out how to make it work. But yeah, it has a lot of potential to really change the landscape.
So regarding cover, another thing, do you ever consider cover for thermoregulation? Is that ever an issue if you're wanting to, so it's not just you've got woods producing mast and cover in terms of I can escape a hunter cover, but do you worry about predation? Do you worry about, thermal cover for deer during the winter in Indiana and Iowa?
I think it really depends on, I think yes, the answer is yes, and of course it always depends, and it probably depends more on what part of the state you're in as far as thermal regulation. So maybe in the northern part of the state, definitely, where we tend to get a lot more snow. We're a little warmer in the southern part of the state, so maybe it's not as much of an issue. But yeah, it's not uncommon to see, deer out in fields bedded down during the middle of the day when it's windy, full sun, soaking the rays up where they're not getting wind in the northern part of the state. So I would say, that, from a thermal regulation standpoint, definitely having that cover that's going to knock the wind down, but also provide some sunlight to them.
Yeah, I think similar thing, particularly with wind and drifting snow. We consider that, and as you go further north, it gets, I know, more and more important. And of course, it's not just mortality during the winter; it's the condition of the does coming out. And I think that, again, I'm not the deer biologist in the room, but that obviously impacts reproduction and your population status. So you got to make sure you have a good winter food source. Fortunately, in Iowa, I just told you we plant 23 million acres of it every year, so that's not too much of a challenge to find a good winter food source. But they obviously can't survive on corn alone, and so they need to supplement that with additional browse or broadleaf plants or whatever they're eating, and then a warm place to spend the cold, snowy days, dense, evergreens or dense shrubby cover, or some parts of the state, cattail, wetland vegetation can be used as good thermal refuge during winter.
You know a lot about that, don't you? The cattails, where you duck hunt.
Well, that's where the pheasants hang out too. So I spend a little bit of time in a frozen cattail marsh in the north.
And it's going back to what you said about winter food. It's not uncommon to see in the winter, 20 to 30 deer out in an alfalfa field. They won't have a whole lot of them, but you'll see, if there's an alfalfa field adjacent to a woods, there's a bunch of deer out there that come out to eat the alfalfa.
Yeah. I wish I could grow alfalfa. Just can't. You can do it, but man, it just takes a lot of effort. In the South with our soils and all that sort of stuff, it just seems to be a challenge. I always recommend to people, you better be able to manage it like a farmer does. Yeah. I mean, there's so many inputs that it requires. It's just easier to grow soybean or winter wheat or something like that than alfalfa.
And then just going back to the alfalfa, so that what got me thinking about cover crops and deer was what impact if we have 1 million acres of cover crops on the landscape, what impact does that alternative forage have on deer damage to forest regeneration and things like that? So I scoured the literature to find what I could, and what I found was there was a study in Minnesota that looked at deer damage, or the percent of forbs, in this case trilliums, that were grazed by deer in these isolated woodlots, and then what impact the landscape configuration had on that. And what they found was that the more alfalfa fields that were within about a mile radius of that woodlot, the less damage they had to the native forbs in the woods. And so that kind of got me sparked interested in seeing, well, if we have all this alternative forage on the landscape, does that have an impact on damage in the woods, regeneration and things like that? I don't know if it does, but it's an interesting question.
I would be willing to bet the house that it does. And you just think of, alfalfa may be one of the most perfect plants for a deer, followed by a soybean. But eventually you get tired of eating the same thing. And so even within our, captive facility, we're giving them food that is all they can eat, as much as they want. It technically has everything they want, and they readily eat it. And you can take a marginal browse species, Chinese privet. I don't know if y'all have Chinese privet. A little too far north.
We did in Tennessee.
You did in Tennessee, yeah. Which is usually I would call it, it's a January, February browse, because it's still green at that time of the year. It's just something different. And also, it's a diversity of diets the same way.
But it doesn't mean it's good for them.
Maybe it's good enough for them. Maybe it's something different.
Not to plug ducks, but they've done that study with ducks, and you can feed ducks a diet of only corn, and of course they eventually just die because they can't. They have to have diversified food incomes. I don't know if that's where you're going with that, but they can't. We know that from pheasants, we know that from ducks, and they've got to have diverse amino acid profiles in their diet to maintain essential bodily functions.
Absolutely.
That's about as much as I know about that. But
so I'll give you an example, Jared, from Craig Harper. So we talked about this a lot, and I can relate it back to a Texas study as well. So I really think deer want a diversity of plants. And so all the different nutrients, maybe just different flavors. I mean, I'm just totally guessing on that. So a forb in the southeast that is rarely browsed is giant ragweed. And so Craig is out, we're working on as you did, looking at comparing soil nutrients to plant nutrients and all that. He goes to Iowa, goes to a soybean field, and he's collecting some soybeans just to get the crude protein and all the nutrients. And he wants to compare it also with some naturally occurring forbs. And he comes up on giant ragweed, and the deer have just hammered it. And so when he told me that, and again, this is just me thinking out loud, I don't know if it's right or wrong, there was this hypothesis for the longest time with supplemental feeding that if you supplement, with a pelleted ration, that it will give deer the liberty to hammer every high-quality forb in the landscape. Because they basically, I've met my maintenance needs, I have enough calories, nutrients, and now I'm going to go out and just look for ice cream plants and going to drive them to local extinction, so to speak. And so this was done, replicated in these studies in Texas, and they found just the opposite. So it was almost like the feed they were getting was so rich, it was so good, that it's almost like I need to buffer my diet with some of these browse species to add more fiber in their diet and things like that. And so I wondered that with Craig's example from Iowa.
And that example is common in Indiana, where you have a soybean field, maybe you have, and the site I'm thinking about is actually a site where we edge feathered against the crop field. So we basically removed all of the trees from about 50 feet next to the crop field for a couple of reasons. One, to provide more habitat for various wildlife species. Quail was my goal there, but also deer and turkey and songbirds and all kinds of stuff. And the farmer's goal was to remove the shade and the competition from the trees next to the field because he was seeing a yield decrease in his corn. And so we did that, and the first year it came back with all kinds of different forbs and everything, and giant ragweed was one of them. And we saw, and common ragweed was another one. And we saw a lot that we would see a lot of browse on giant ragweed and not quite as much on the common ragweed, which is the opposite of what I would think it would be, given how good common ragweed is for deer and how much they like to browse it.
So maybe the higher crude protein or whatever they would be selecting, they accomplished that with the soybean. And now they're seeking other... Just think about us. We had lunch today. We added a bunch of different things on our plate. We didn't all just focus on the barbecue. We had a little salad and things like that. So, okay, guys, we're going to have to wrap up here in a few minutes. Anything you guys want to talk about? Adam, maybe something going on in Iowa you want to talk about?
Yeah, the thing that I spend the most time thinking about with deer management, because of the luxury that we have in Iowa, where our forests are really productive for deer and our row crop system is really productive for deer. Deer management's on a statewide scale, it's relatively easy, but we are concerned, of course, about chronic wasting disease, and that's true across the Midwest. And I know you've had real experts on the show talking about the disease, and you're not going to get anything you haven't heard from me, but I just always encourage folks to stay tuned to those things. In Iowa, we've had it since 2013 in our wild deer, and we've just found it in a totally new place in the state this year in southern Iowa. And so we now have, we're going to be monitoring chronic wasting disease in the two cores of our deer population in the state, where the most forest is, northeastern Iowa and southern Iowa. So it's an interesting thing with, I think, the message that I have for deer hunters and land managers and everybody is, we all have an important role to play. We've got to stay vigilant about this disease, know what to do about carcass disposal and managing herds on your land and minimizing concentrations of deer around artificial mineral and food sources and things like that. If we all work together, we'll see where this thing goes. Again, I'm a duck biologist. I don't have the answers, but it's certainly something we're thinking a lot about. So.
But in your job now, you have to provide some answers.
Yeah, well, or I can at least connect people with the resources, right? And with CWD, we all know there's some bad stuff out there, and some high-profile people are saying
a lot
really
of misinformation,
untrue things about CWD, and that's unfortunate. There's a lot of uncertainty about this disease. That's for sure. This stuff makes my head spin. Just understanding how prions function and move and how unique they are. But we do know a fair bit, and I think most wildlife, at least Midwestern wildlife resource agencies, are acting in the best interest of the deer in the habitat. And I think we just need to kind of everybody stay tuned and follow trusted resources like your shop and others and National Wildlife Health Center and people like that, and see where this goes.
Yeah, just a little plug with that really frustrates me is you'll see a lot of these YouTube videos and quote experts, celebrities, all that really give it to the state wildlife agency for what they're trying to do because it inconvenienced them.
Yeah.
And what you just said, Adam, is so important that people forget is the state wildlife agency has the best interest of the resource in mind for the rest of our lives.
Yep, exactly.
And so they want to ensure there may be some short-term pain, but they want to ensure that we have white-tailed deer, in our landscape forever and ever. So, I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks. Jared, what do you think?
That all sounds good to me. We're in Indiana. I guess we're a little more fortunate that we haven't had a case of CWD yet in the state. However, we have had bovine TB, which is another deer disease. That one, is one that's transmissible to humans. And luckily, we think after the DNR did a whole bunch of monitoring and checking hunter-harvested deer and looking for the disease, we, after a couple of years of that, they came to the thought that it's at a level that's undetectable. So. And they think that it was just a spillover case, and so maybe it spilled over from a cattle operation or a captive servitor operation, and it's not a reservoir in the state. And so we think that as of right now, I think they're going to do some continuing monitoring on that. But as of right now, I think it's at a prevalence level that's below 0.25%, so really low if it's even out there on the landscape. So, and that was. An effort that was led by our DNR and our state DNR deer biologist, Dr. Joe Caudell, as well as the Indiana Board of Animal Health. So there was a really big team effort to look into that and see what they could do to help make sure that didn't end up staying in the herd.
Good news for Indiana. That's great. Mm-hmm. Anything else you wanted to talk about, forest management or anything before we wrap up?
Yes, I do have a few more thoughts. I kind of want to circle back to the habitat management stuff because that's kind of my bailiwick. That's what I like to do, and I'm always interested to hear how it's done in Mississippi versus in other parts of the country. So, I guess what are your top management objective, or what do you prescribe to landowners when they come to you asking for what they can do to increase deer on their property?
I'm glad you asked. Typically, in our system, it's food limited and not cover limited. Now, and we got to talk about cover versus, escape cover, thermal cover. It can be an issue sometimes. Usually, it's not. Most often, if someone is wanting to, and this is rare, I want to grow my population. Usually, people don't need to grow it in the South. They need to reduce it and increase quality. So, very rarely is habitat management practiced. There's a lot of reasons for that. Habitat management's hard. It takes a little more knowledge and skill and work to do it. The other thing is that so much of our state is privately owned, and so most hunters are hunting on leased land. And so if I am leasing land, I'm not going to be able to burn. I'm not going to be able to create openings. I have to do what they say. So it really is that it depends and site specific, like you mentioned. But I would say more often than not, the population is limited by quality food. And our strategies would be to increase quality food, preferably through habitat management, but if not, then we're going to have to do that through food plots, supplemental food plantings. And then also a strategy can be where a lot of people in the South interested in deer management are letting bucks get older. And our philosophy is that we can reduce the deer density not only with does but with bucks. Bucks that don't show the probability of turning into a deer, a buck that they want to harvest and hang on the wall. So, for example, where I'm from, if we have a buck that's 3.5 years old and is well below average antler size, that's a great buck to harvest. And so we address deer density two ways with does and buck harvest. Now, if someone also has compelling evidence that fawn recruitment is very low, so the deer population appears to be in good condition, physical indices are good, but they have either through camera surveys or very reliable hunter observations that fawn recruitment is only 20%, then they have a fawn cover problem that needs to be addressed. So what did you ask first? What's the most common problem? Food. Second most is going to be cover. Yeah. Very opposite from you guys. Yeah, quite the opposite. Yeah. And then even in our ag region, you will see, I'm sure it's a lot, well, when a state's 82%, row crop agriculture, places where crops aren't, where you see trees, typically doesn't provide good cover either. So in our neck of the woods, it's those are usually tupelo gum, sloughs, and things like that. So it's parts of the landscape that were too wet to cultivate. And so these types of trees, tupelo gum and stuff, grow and occupy that site. Number one, they're not producing any meaningful mass for deer. And number two, it's wide open. Mm-hmm. It's so wet, you don't have a shrub layer, and it's wide open. And so literally you can have thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, and you'll see trees scattered, but there's nowhere for a deer to hide. And they wonder, where did all the deer go during winter? Yeah. So
yeah, it's interesting. I've been in Maine for 3 days now, and I've seen a groundhog and 2 marine mammals, not a single hooved, not a deer, not a moose, and we've covered some ground.
Yeah.
Imagine in Iowa, you can, as soon as you get out of the city, you're going to see deer. It's really interesting, different parts of the country and different resource availability and things.
So I talked with Joe earlier, and this bottleneck up here for them is winter.
Yeah.
And so he talked about the deer yarding behavior, and it's just a very different. I mean, these deer are huddled up for months, just living on
surviving
fat and nipping on twigs and just trying to make it through. And if it's a normal winter, they're going to be just fine. But if winter stretches out another month, they have a lot of deer deaths. And Joe and I didn't talk about this on the podcast, but we were talking about it other times too, is that when their indices, they start noticing that they've had 2 mild winters, and they notice that the deer population has grown, they want to invoke doe harvest, basically to preventively kill deer so winter doesn't. And so that's different in the South, is that they're still going to make it, they're just going to become food limited and get smaller. Quality goes down, but here it is life or death.
Yeah, it's interesting.
If you have too many deer. Yeah.
And that's a neat example of resource utilization too, that those deer are going to die anyway. That's a classic case of an opportunity to harvest a harvestable surplus, as we're taught in freshman wildlife management.
That's right.
It's a pretty neat example of scientific management.
Yeah, yep. Well, gentlemen, we have been talking here over 50 minutes, so I think we've probably covered enough.
Been that long?
It's been 50, been 50
Who knew
minutes.
Talking about deer could be fun?
Welcome. Well, you're welcome. See?
Thanks.
You could have never talked about ducks for that long. Yeah. You'd have heard snoring on the other side if you'd done it. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
All right, thank you.
We're glad you joined us today and hope you learned something valuable about deer management. If you have questions about this podcast or a question about a topic we haven't discussed, please log on to msudeerlab.com, click on the Deer University tab, and send us your questions. We'll get to them as soon as possible. In closing, we want to thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. We also want to thank the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowments that support deer research and education.